Welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics Forum of Public Affairs and the Council of Women World Leaders lecture series. The Institute of Politics was founded in 1966 as a living memorial to President Kennedy to inspire students in the dynamics of politics. The Council of Women World Leaders, founded in 1996 and now housed at the Kennedy School, is pleased to sponsor this event with the Institute of Politics, the Women's Caucus, and the South Asian Caucus. The Council of Women World Leaders is comprised of current and former women presidents and prime ministers. It seeks to mobilize the experience, global visibility, and wisdom of a group of leaders. It is also symbolically representative of the inclusive possibilities of leadership, and works with the Kennedy School of Government to advance our understanding of leaders and leadership. Today, at this crucial juncture in history, we need leaders who fit our times. And these are times of great transition. We need leaders who see things not as they are, but as they should be. We also must observe and unlearn how leaders both shape and are shaped by events and forces around them. In history, we've heard something. We've heard that some men are born to greatness, some men achieve greatness, and some men have greatness thrust upon them. Today, of course, we realize how incomplete that thought is. There are many definitions of leaders, but the best one that I've found is what Vivaldi said made the best composer. He said the best composer has a cool head and a hot heart. I think that's what makes the best leader. They have passion and action and vision and mission. It is what we seek in our leaders and what we seek in ourselves. The Council of Women World Leaders, and I personally, am very pleased to be here today with our distinguished guest speaker, Benazir Bhutto, who is a member of the Council and truly a global figure. I'd like to now ask Pippa Norris to introduce our speaker. Pippa is the very prolific Associate Director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Her research focuses on comparative international politics, the media, and gender. Pippa?
Well, first, I'd very much like to thank Laura for the vision and initiative and leadership which she has shown in bringing the Council for Women World Leaders to the Kennedy School, a very important part of our leadership program. And I'd like to add my welcome, of course, to Benazir Bhutto, both from the Kennedy School and from Harvard. Let's understand why it's so important to have women as world leaders. If we look around the world today, we often think that somehow women are making it through in terms of politics. But if you look around the world, what you also find is that out of 180 countries, we have only 10 women who are elected to heads of state. Very few indeed. And if we look, what we also find is that, in fact, Southeast Asia and many of the countries there have played a major role. We can think, of course, of Indira Gandhi of India. We can think of Prime Minister Rahman of Bangladesh. We can think of President Bandaraki in Sri Lanka. And, of course, Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan. Benazir Bhutto was educated at Oxford and at Harvard. She was at the Radcliffe College. And the eldest daughter of Prime Minister Bhutto, who led Pakistan's People's Party, and whose father was ousted in a military coup in 1977 and killed 2 years later under a regime of military dictatorship. Benazir was placed under house arrest and suffered many severe difficulties in that period, before eventually leaving for a period of exile in London, and she returned to Pakistan only in 1986, when parties were allowed again to be competitive in that country. During this period, she immediately was able to start up her father's party and to improve and strengthen the Pakistan People's Party. And in 1988, she succeeded in becoming elected as Prime Minister, the first woman ever elected to head an Islamic country. She left this office in November 1996, almost exactly a year ago today, but remains still active in the Pakistan's People's Party. So, Prime Minister Bhutto, welcome back to Harvard. Welcome for your inspiration as a woman of courage and conviction. And we look forward to learning of your inspiration and your experiences as the leader of Pakistan and your ongoing work in this regard. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I am no stranger to America, and being here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, I'd just like you all to know how wonderful it is to come back home. I spent 4 of the happiest years of my life as a student at Harvard University, and those days now seem like a dream to me. The last year has been an extraordinary, difficult period of time for me, for my family, for my country. I'm well aware that many of you have been exposed to information, or should I say, disinformation. I know that you have heard a negative barrage attacking me and the record of my 2 administrations as the chief executive of Pakistan. That is why I am here. I still have the strength. I still have the fight, especially when it comes to the truth. I fully intend to defend myself and my record from this outrageous and sexist character assassination that is being conducted against me. For what has happened to me, what is happening in Pakistan, may not in fact be unique, but part of a growing and disturbing trend as the world approaches the new millennium. The attacks against me are painful, and they are outright lies. But it is only a more extreme version of what appears to be a universal deterioration of civil dialogue in politics, not just in Pakistan, but all over the world. The search for political consensus, the main characteristic of a democratic society, has degenerated into partisan hysteria, a rule or ruin philosophy. The breakdown of cooperation threatens the legitimacy of democratic values and norms in the modern, post-Cold War international society. This is a new phenomenon that blemishes the body politic. Consensus, civility, and comity have been replaced with slander, prejudice, and partisanship. I would like to read you some thoughts that capture what I am saying to you today. And I quote, "Partisan politics is polluting our most important legal and ethical processes and is damaging our political system. Proceedings, while billed as impartial, have become little more than witch hunts designed to humiliate the opposing political party. The scandal machine that has developed bankrupts individuals who are little more than pawns in larger political agendas. It threatens the ability of the political system to attract the bright, dedicated people that our nation deserves." These are not my words, but they may as well be. This is not written about Pakistan, but it might as well be. For what I have quoted to you are the words of Robert Bennett, President Clinton's lawyer, from an essay attacking the subjugation of the legal and ethical process to a blatantly partisan political agenda. Right now, across the oceans, in Asia, the Pakistan People's Party, which I lead, is being subjected to a political witch hunt clouded in a so-called legal process. the people of Pakistan honored me by electing me as their Prime Minister in the only 2 fair, free, and impartial elections held in the last 10 years. But my political opponents saw to it that both governments were removed by presidential edict and not permitted to complete their full terms. Not a single member of my family has been spared. My father-in-law, my husband, and my brother-in-law have all been arrested. My mother and my sister-in-law are facing legal proceedings. Another sister-in-law had her house raided at midnight without a search warrant or a magistrate. Yet another relative fled the country when he was called to the Prime Minister's house, grabbed by the shirt, and threatened, "You either do what we want or end up in a death cell." And one of our defense lawyers was kidnapped by the regime for over 2 months without a word of his whereabouts. Members of the Pakistan People's Party and my political staff, including women, have faced similar treatment. I therefore wrote to the United Nations Secretary General highlighting the human rights abuses. I was castigated by the regime for doing so. I was criticized for washing Pakistan's dirty linen in public. They weren't concerned that they were dirtying the linen. They were only concerned that I was washing it in public. And that was when the regime decided to raid my sister-in-law's house at midnight to harass her and to harass me. That was when they decided to arrest a second defense lawyer, charging him with the kidnapping of the first. And that was when they decided to file yet another murder case against my husband. And that was when they falsely claimed that 8 companies belonging to me had been frozen by the Swiss authorities. I had nothing to do with those companies, but to humiliate and degrade me internationally, the regime claimed they were mine. I know that truth and justice will eventually triumph. I know that I have the will to prove, not only for myself, but for women all over, that we have the strength to stand up and defend our convictions. But in the meantime, our family life has been affected. My young children miss their father. Not only my family, but those of my relatives, political colleagues, and supporters are being bankrupted defending charges in different courts of law. Our time and energy is depleted in reaction rather than action to fulfill the vindictive lust of the present regime. However, this politics of confrontation is not limited to Pakistan alone. All over the world, we find a greater interest in the human side of political personalities. Human frailty enthralls us. This new politics of distortion and destabilization has paralyzed constructive dialogue. It has confused the public. It has led to a great cynicism across the continents about public leaders. And it is a trend that is intensifying, not diminishing. In the United States, even a discussion of the ratification of a ban on chemical weapons takes on the character of a street gang rumble. And while both the House and Senate spend millions upon millions of dollars in repetitive and redundant hearings whose aim would seem to be more political than programmatic, no progress at all seems to be made on the entitlement crisis that threatens America's fiscal standing in the new century. a ruling party that once thrived on the prerogatives of the special prosecutor during the Reagan era now denounces exactly the same application to the Clinton era. Another party which decried the powers of the special prosecutor in the 80s demands more and more of such appointments to investigate the opposition in the 90s. Rule or ruin. The situation deteriorated so badly in Washington that it was thought necessary for a civility retreat to be convened, basically to remind the members of the Congress of the United States of America the rules of common courtesy and civil dialogue. This, my friends, is in the greatest and oldest democracy on earth. Political expediency has replaced political idealism, and political expediency has no bounds, no limits, and no taste. This trend, as I said, is consistent across the continents. 4 Indian prime ministers have changed within 1 calendar year. Governments disintegrating, not over policy, but over politics. Not over programs, but over power. Just last month, in India's largest state, a riot erupted on the floor of the assembly. Legislators hitting each other over the heads with furniture, inkwells thrown across the chamber, 14 parliamentarians injured. This in what is often called the largest democracy on earth. A peace process in the Middle East is allowed to be frozen, with substance often overshadowed by whispered innuendo, a decade's progress hanging in the balance. In Bangladesh, the ruling party and the opposition interchanges almost identical strategies of parliamentary boycotts and street disruptions as power shifts from one party to another. In Bosnia, leaders pledged to a multi-ethnic state are defeated by ethno-nationalists threatening the very existence of the Dayton Accords. In Pakistan, the new government elected in March almost collapses in October when it begins to undermine the judiciary simply because the Supreme Court admitted corruption charges against the Prime Minister filed by my party. All over the world, what do we find? All over the world, recriminations, finger-pointing, and partisan condemnations are the modus operandi of the new political order. Hardly the quiet Pax Americana that many had predicted. We cannot afford, ladies and gentlemen, to be distracted from the real issues at hand, building a political consensus for a new political era. I believe that our generation stands at the doorway of history, not only the doorway of a new century, but the doorway of a new millennium. And as we prepare ourselves to meet this new century, this new millennium, I believe we need to clearly understand the challenges that still await us and await the new century. I believe there are 4 simultaneous challenges that the world faces today. First, the rise of ethnic and religious hatred, prejudice, and intolerance. Second, the gulf of wealth and health emerging between the developed and developing countries and within nations themselves. Third, the growing sense of alienation by the people in a complex and fast-moving world in the ability of their governments to resolve the problems that the new technological era faces. And fourth, the continuing gender inequity in all societies, West as well as East that creates social division in the society as we move towards a new century. The only good thing I can say for the 40 years of the Cold War is that its bipolar competition managed to suppress the ethnic and religious antagonisms that had dominated the first half of the 20th century. The simplistic dichotomy between the West and the East compartmentalized and clarified the world order. But this also had negative consequences. During the superpower confrontation, containing communism was paramount, even at the cost of democracy, even at the cost of human rights. Countries like Pakistan saw long periods of dictatorship, decades when freedom was suppressed, the press censored, and billions of dollars in military and economic assistance siphoned. Similar patterns existed in South and Central America, in Portugal and Spain, in Greece, in South Korea, and in large parts of the African continent. The dawn of the new information age helped change the destiny of nations caught in the grip of dictatorship. CNN had a significant role, I believe, in bringing about the end of communism. I know many people thought it was just President Reagan, but I think he got a lot of assistance from CNN. Because people in Eastern and Central Europe saw the beauty of freedom. They saw the consumer choices that were available, and they asked a simple question: why not here? People in South Asia and South America saw free people making free decisions and making free choices not only in elections, but in their careers, in their professions. And they too asked a simple question: why not here? With the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, many in the world believed that our 45-year thermonuclear nightmare was over and a peace dividend could spread across the world. But as T.S. Eliot once observed, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. The twilight of the century has become Eliot's shadow. The idea, that platonic cave of peace that we prayed for, has eluded us. Its illusion has left people impatient, frustrated, and angry. Those who believed that democracy meant instant financial progress, instant improvement in the standard of living, have lost faith in governmental systems. The frustration of newly empowered electorates, combined with the regeneration of long suppressed ethnic and religious tensions, creates a very dangerous situation for the world as we approach the new millennium. The United States, in its extraordinary moment of international predominance, has an obligation to act as a catalyst to promote democratic values, to ensure self-determination, to enforce United Nations resolutions, and to diffuse potential international conflicts before they engulf the world. And one of these long simmering tensions is related to the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. The Valley of Kashmir has been occupied by India and denied the basic right of self-determination. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children have lost their lives in the quest for freedom. It is time now, consistent with President Clinton's stated policy of preemptive crisis management, to facilitate an agreement between India and Pakistan so that the people of Kashmir and Jammu are finally allowed to determine their own future. And ladies and gentlemen, this is an era where we see an increasing focus on Islam and the West. The entire world community, and specifically the United States, has a fundamental strategic interest in events in the Muslim world. All across the world, in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, and Southeast Asia, in Africa, 1 billion Muslims are at the crossroads. They must choose between progress and extremism. They must choose between education and ignorance. They must choose between the force of new technologies and the forces of old repression. Thus, 1 billion Muslims must choose between the past and the future. The United States must do everything within its power to ensure that progressive, pluralistic Muslim countries like Pakistan are in a position to serve as role models to the entire Islamic world. And Pakistan is also an important Asian country at the crossroads to the strategic oil reserves of the Gulf and Central Asia, and to the markets of South Asia and East Asia. In terms of demographics, in terms of production, in terms of consumption, in terms of markets, in terms of an expanding capital-intensive middle class, the Asian continent will surely set the tone, set the pace, and dominate the economic and geopolitical exigencies of the coming era. I wonder how many people realize that Pakistan is the second largest Muslim state on earth. A state, as I said, at the crossroads to the oil-rich Gulf and Central Asia. A state, as I said, at the crossroads to the markets of South Asia and East Asia. A state that can serve as a model of moderation and modernity to 1 billion Muslims across the planet. As a Pakistani, I wish to explore with you today the West's relationship with the Islamic world and the role that we can play to create a civil, political, economic, and religious dialogue between the East and the West at this critical moment. I believe it was only 4 years ago when Harvard professor Samuel Huntington shocked the world with his provocative essay entitled Clash of Civilizations. As a Muslim woman who had been educated and lived extensively in the United States and the United Kingdom, I was initially taken aback by the negative conclusion and the specter of inevitable conflict that he outlined. I particularly disagreed with Professor Huntington's unshakable pessimism about the emerging clash between the West and an increasingly self-confident and economically independent Islamic world. But 4 years later, my assessment of Professor Huntington's thesis has moderated. At the very least, I believe that his article has served a very useful purpose in bringing to the forefront of intellectual opinion significant issues that do warrant exploration, that do warrant debate. For whether we like it or not, whether it must be so or not, the world seems to be increasingly looking at the values and mores of the West and the values and traditions of Islam as mutually exclusive and confrontational. Let's explore some of these issues today. The world is certainly a different place now than it was just 10 short years ago. At that point, the nuclear threat was omnipresent. The Cold War raged on between the West and the Soviet bloc, reaching a boiling point in the battle for the self-determination of Afghanistan. It was the alliance between the West and the Islamic world through the 50s and the 60s, through the 70s and the 80s, that was central to the containment of communism on the Asian continent. For communism, Afghanistan became an overheated pressure cooker that manifested the inevitable doom of a system that could not realistically address its people's political and economic needs. Muslim resistance to the Soviets in Afghanistan proved once and for all that the Soviet Union could not, with all its military might, suppress the forces of history and the forces of justice. Afghanistan proved that might does not make right. It was the victory of the Mujahideen, the Islamic freedom fighters supported by the Western Muslim alliance, that proved to extinguish the fading embers of a dying system. This alliance, that is the Western Muslim alliance, broke the back of the Soviet Union. It was our joint stand against the Soviet occupiers of Afghanistan that secured for all mankind the final victory of democracy and market-based economics. I remember vividly my own feelings on February 15, 1989, when as Prime Minister of Pakistan, I celebrated the final withdrawal of Soviet forces from our frontiers in Afghanistan. Little did I realize at that glorious moment that the victory in Afghanistan would be a catalyst to a curious consequence. The West's interest in, indeed need for, alliance with the Islamic world would and has steadily deteriorated over the last 8 years. Interdependence during the Cold War period gave way to indifference in the post-Cold War period. Indifference has now, in many ways, been replaced with apprehension. There are some in the West who would like to think of Muslims as terrorists and fanatics. I would like to assure you that Muslims are neither. Muslims, on the other hand, who benefited from economic and military assistance from the West for half a century, are bewildered by the sudden turn of events where aid has totally ceased with the end of the communist threat. Muslims who consider themselves allies of the West do not comprehend the distancing of the West. For instance, a country like Pakistan was receiving $4.6 billion of military and economic assistance from the United States. Now, if somebody is earning $1,000 a month and getting an additional $500 from a friend, and one day the friend turns around and says, sorry, I don't have the $500, live on $1,000. That means a drop in living standards. And that's what it meant for many Muslim countries, including Pakistan. Suddenly the aid dried up, and it coincided with the period of the resurgence of democracy. And instead of being better off, people were worse off, because now we had less resources and less income. And many could not understand why, at a time when their own resources were diminishing, the West was beginning to perceive the Muslims with a certain degree of apprehension. Because Islam is a religion that sanctifies Abraham, Moses, and Jesus as prophets, it was even more bewildering for Muslims to find that the West suddenly was suspicious of them. And Islam is, in fact, an integral part of the Judeo-Christian civilization. So being an integral part of the Judeo-Christian civilization, it was a sudden shock for Muslims to find that the world was being perceived as two blocks, that is, the West and Islam. Now, Muslims do have certain problems with the way the West reacts to certain incidents. For instance, Muslims could not understand why one of the great cities of Europe was reduced to a rubble by a systematic destruction, and that this reduction of the city was captured nightly for all the world to see by CNN. Muslims could not understand why the West stood by indifferent. This kind of event of bloodshed in a Muslim city in the heart of Europe, with the West standing silently by, plays into the hands of extremists who say that if it were Christian Paris on fire and not Muslim Sarajevo, would the West have acquiesced? In the heart of Europe, a Muslim city was being destroyed, and Muslims all over the world felt abandoned by the West. So we muse on the lessons of history and the lessons of human nature. While many in the West believe that there is no place for democracy in Islam, given the few number of democratic Muslim states, Muslims, on the other hand, believe that democracy is inherent in our faith. In Islam, dictatorship is never condoned. Dictatorship is considered a usurpation of the power of the people. Muslims are exhorted to fight tyranny wherever they see it. And indeed, Muslims are told that if you do not have the strength to fight tyranny when you see it, go into exile. But do not stand silent in the face of tyranny, for to be silent in the face of tyranny is to condone tyranny. There are 4 democratic principles at the heart of Islam. The first is consultation or shura, then consensus or ijma, and finally independent judgment or ijtihad. Instead of Islam being incompatible with democracy, our holy book makes it clear that the principal operations of the democratic process, consultation between the elected officials and the people, accountability of leaders to the people they serve, are fundamental to Islam. The holy book says that Islamic society is contingent on mutual advice through mutual discussions on an equal footing. Let me repeat that term, equal footing. Ladies and gentlemen, the Holy Quran is as committed to equality as it is to democracy, as committed to pluralism and tolerance as it is to order and doctrine. I know this is inconsistent with Western stereotypes, but nevertheless, it is true. Consultation under the Holy Quran demands that public decisions are made by representative personalities, by men and by women who enjoy the confidence of the people and the integrity of their own character. Consensus provides a basis for majority rule. And according to the Muslim scholar Louis Safi, the legitimacy of the state depends upon the extent to which state organization and power reflect the will of the Ummah or the people. And in the third key element of Islamic democracy, independent judgment, we see an additional element of personal responsibility that the West too is trying to emulate and which lies at the heart of the Clinton administration's programmatic ideology shaped by the writings of sociologist Amitai Etzioni. Islamic law rests on the consent of and the consultation with the people as fundamentally as British parliamentary democracy or American separation of powers is founded on the people's will. Western political scientists these days hypothesize populist strategies to create more effective forms of participatory democracy. But Muslims do not believe they have to go back to the drawing boards to conceptualize democratic order. It is right there in the Holy Book. Under Islam, we do not have to create a sense of community and individual responsibility. It is there in the Holy Book itself. Enlightened Muslims find Western lectures on democracy condescending. Muslims need the West to acknowledge that dictatorship came out because of the strategic need to contain communism. Dictatorship did not come about because it was a part of Muslim faith or culture. That is why for decades, not only Muslim Asia, but Spain and Portugal were governed by fascism. Greece was ruled by a military junta. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile faced social and political repression. On October 31st, 1997, in a lecture in Cyprus, Professor Huntington ruefully noted that non-democratic regimes, more often than not, were pro-American. The future of democracy in the post-Cold War world will remain contingent on the strategic interests of Pax Americana. The strategic interests have changed. They are no longer of an ideological nature. They are of an economic nature. Market politics global trade, and energy reserves remain the strategic interests of the West in the new political era in the post-Cold War period. There is much that Islam and the West can do together to build a new economic and social order as we approach the new millennium. But the 21st century must be a century of moral universality, not selectivity. It is time for the West to understand that colonialism and exploitation, both of a material and spiritual kind, are over. It is also time for the Islamic world to begin to rely on ourselves and each other to address the lingering problems of the 20th century and the unlimited opportunities of the 21st century. The Muslim world needs to provide leadership in establishing the public parameters of possibilities, in delineating Islam's role in the emerging political order, and in the new explosion of technology and communication in the new global economy. In addressing the new exigencies of the new era, we must be prepared to work side by side, East and West, with other religions to improve the quality of life for all the people on this earth. We must live, and we Muslims must live by the true spirit of Islam, not just by its rituals. To those who would claim to speak for Islam but would deny to our women a place in society, I say, the ethos of Islam is equality, equality between the sexes. There is no religion that in its writings and its teachings is more respectful for the role of women in society than Islam. To those in the West who would condemn Islam for being anti-women, let me, as the first Muslim woman elected Prime Minister of her country, recall that 3 Muslim countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Turkey, have all had democratically elected women as head of their governments. In other words, my friends, there is much that we can learn from each other, Islam and the West and Islam, as we cross into a new century and into a new millennium. There are many problems that we confront simultaneously. The Islamic extremists who burn books and keep young women in parda are really not that different from the Christian fundamentalists who attack clinics in America, or the Jewish extremists who massacre worshippers in Hebron. So let us decide to cast aside myths and stereotypes about each other. For Islam and for the West, it is time to attack the common and real enemies of our respective societies. These enemies are not people. They are ignorance and hatred. These enemies are not ethnic minorities. They are starvation and intolerance. Myopia and prejudice, whether it be religious, political, ethnic, gender, or intellectual, are the common enemies of our hopes for the 21st century. They are the fuel of the clash of civilizations. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to cross together into a new century and into a new millennium. Whether we cross the millennium holding hands or at odds with each other is very much in our own control. The opportunities are boundless for all who believe in the blessings of the modern era, the application of technology to addressing the economic and social conditions of mankind, the end of intolerance, the flourishing of democracy and human rights. For Islam and for the West, the forces of change, the thrust of modernity and technology, the strength of tolerance, the inevitability of freedom and liberty, the sanctity of human rights are all converging on this time, on our generation, on our generation, yours and mine, providing an extraordinary opportunity for us to move the world. For in less than 800 days, we will witness, for only the third time in recorded history, the momentous turning of the millennium. Where and what will we be at that extraordinary moment when the huge ball drops and the year 2000 lights up the sky? Will we be prisoners of the mindset of the past? Or will we be liberated to the endless possibilities of a historic future? Our generation, yours and mine, the first in history, is empowered to control our own destiny. The world has finally accepted, in the words of Robert Browning, that ignorance is not innocence, but sin. So, ladies and gentlemen, I come here to Harvard, where I once studied and where you now study, to tell you of my vision, for I see a third millennium where the gap between the rich and the poor states evaporates, where illiteracy and hunger and malnutrition are conquered. I see a third millennium where human rights are universal. I see a third millennium where civil dialogue is restored. I see a third millennium where people's trust in government and in themselves is restored. I see a third millennium of tolerance where religions respect other religions. I see a third millennium where every child is planned, wanted, nurtured, and supported. I see a third millennium where the birth of a girl child is welcomed with the same joy as the birth of a boy. This is the third millennium I see for my country and for yours, for my children and for yours. And I hope together we succeed. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Bhutto, thank you very much for those remarks. We have our usual microphones here at both sides, and if when you ask your question, and we do hope it's a question, not a statement, if you can introduce yourself, say who you are, and ideally if we can have the students first, and then we'll move on from there. So first, if we start on this side, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Madam Bhutto, thank you for coming to Harvard. We have learned a great deal from you. My name is Randall Pierce, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Last week, President Clinton was asked to respond to the level of scrutiny that he and his family have suffered while he has served as President of the United States in the context of the visit of Chinese President Jiang Zemin. And he defended the right of people to question him while he is in office, both personally and professionally, as one of the fundamental underpinnings of democracy. I'm wondering, at what point do we sacrifice the right to question our leaders to preserve the civil dialogue that you're encouraging us to embrace today? When do you pass from policy to politics and from programs to power?
That's a $64 million question. I wish I had the answer. I don't, but I often found it frustrating that what we were doing, I can speak for my country in real terms, in terms of building 30,000 schools, primary schools in 3 years, in terms of training and recruiting 50,000 lady health visitors to go out and bring the population growth rate down, didn't really merit much interest or attention, although these are programs that were fundamentally changing situations. I found as Prime Minister that often people were more interested on whether I had gained weight, whether I was wearing clothes that were frumpy, whether I was expecting a baby, and I found this very frustrating. I also found it very easy for my opponents to make charges of corruption. And you can't go on saying, it's not true, it's not true, it's not true each time. I mean, there used to be a point when somebody had to prove it. Now it seems that we just have to say it's not true, and at the end of the time, it can get pretty exhausting. I know that as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't like to be Prime Minister again, because I'd rather have goodwill and respect than allow my opponents to take advantage of a situation where a Muslim woman Prime Minister is an unusual phenomena and people are interested in every aspect of her life, and anything that is said about me makes headlines news. For instance, if I'm accused of corruption, it's headline news in the Arabic papers, in the South Asian papers, and Japanese papers, and in Western papers. But when my party files a corruption charge in a court of law against the Prime Minister, it doesn't make headline news anywhere. So I do feel that we are living in an age where the television has brought leaders so close to us that we don't only want to know what they're doing, we want to know what's wrong with them, because it's the age of the anti-hero. You can't really be that good. You must be doing something wrong, and we're going to find out. So, I don't know what the balance is. I think people must have the right to question their leaders. But I also wish I could get up one day and find the newspapers not full of volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, and terrorist bombings, and that somebody would say, well, something nice happened today. Let's take you to Harvard Yard. There was this little child crossing the road, and somebody stepped forward to save it. Something nice. We don't hear anything nice. And it's our fault. We as a public, I feel, want to be told the dreadful things that are happening and that doomsday is around the corner. And we as a public need to find the balance, that where do we say that we're interested in just the person, and where do we want to know what's actually happening in the field. I know political leaders often respond to gallops. I was told to respond to gallops, and I was just old-fashioned. I said, no, I want history to be the final judge. I want scholars to go into the indices. But too often, leaders are tempted to respond to the public mood by doing something superficial rather than substantive, because people will be satisfied with the superficial and will not be looking for the substantive. So I wish I had the answer. I would defend to my last breath the right of every individual to question their public leaders. But I also wonder how we can get attention refocused back on issues.
Thank you.
Ms. Bhutto, I'm Amita Paul. I'm from India, and I feel as proud and privileged to be welcoming you here as I used to feel in Wolfson West in LMH when you used to live in the room beneath me, and when we used to welcome you to the Union where you were president. You were as scintillating as I expected you to be, which is delightful. But I have a concern about an undertone in your address, which I may be entirely wrong, which seemed to be distancing you from Southeast Asia to bring you closer to the West. I know that I entirely appreciate your political acumen in being here and saying things in a particular way, but one of the consequences of globalization is that your voice right now is being heard by India and by Southeast Asia as much as by the United States. And the undertone which worries me has a fallout, as I'm sure you expect, in memories that I have of my visits to Buddhist Ladakh, to Gujar and Sikh Jammu, to Muslim majority Srinagar, to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. I have had the privilege and the pleasure of talking to people everywhere, and perhaps the dominant identity of Kashmiriyat is what occupies them more. And what concerns me is that did I hear you wrong when I thought that we were perhaps going back to a situation where 50 years ago we let the British draw the lines, and
I'm
today
sorry, do you
are
have a- do you
allowing,
have a question here?
yes,
Because
are
we'd like
now allowing we are inviting the Western world to draw the lines on something which is really concerned with self-determination. And my question is, am I wrong in presuming that? And a final comment, which is to say that from the ground of Harvard Veritas and with memories of Oxford's lost causes and forgotten loyalties, I extend the hand of eternal friendship to you again.
I thank you for your hand of friendship. I think people and people contact between India and Pakistan is very important. I'm sure Indians have their point of view, and I respect that. And I'm sure Indians also respect us for having our point of view. I have never been to Ladakh. I wish I could go, and maybe you can help me one day to go to Ladakh or Jammu. But I have supported, as a young student, when I was here, I never ate lettuce or grapes, because in those days we used to support Cesar Chavez and what he was doing. I took part in marches against the Vietnam War. I stood against apartheid. I stood for the right of the Palestinians for a homeland of their own. And in the same way, not just as a Pakistani, but as a human being, I support the right of the people of Jammu and Kashmir to self-determination. I just wish our two countries could find a way where we could allow the Kashmiris to determine their own future. But you know, even if people disagree on political disputes, it doesn't mean they don't have to like each other. I'm addressing this Western audience because I don't get many invitations to India. I went to Sri Lanka. I'd go to India too.
Thank you. And up here as well.
Assalamu alaikum, Muhtarama Benazir Bhutto. I'm Sana. I study at Harvard. I'm from Pakistan. Since you reminded me that in Islam, Muslims should be holding their leaders accountable, I just had this question for you, and I was wondering what your response would be. According to the laws in Pakistan, the personal landholding of a person cannot be more than 500 acres, and that given 3 members of your family, yourself, your husband Asif Zardari, and your mother Benazir Bhutto, should be holding a total land area of 1,500 acres. And we also assume that that fertile land yields about 2,000 rupees an acre a year. Your total income should not be more than about 3 million rupees, which would be about $600,000 per year. So how do you account for having spent about 11 years in Cannes in London with a pretty luxurious lifestyle? How can you account for the millions in Swiss accounts which you have accepted, and how can you present that as legal property?
Thank you, Sana. You know
welcome.
more about my personal affairs than my tax accountant or I do. When you find those Swiss millions, do bring them to me. I was indeed born to a privileged family and to a wealthy family. In fact, 3 of us were undergraduates at Harvard together without scholarships. So if 3 of us could afford to come to Harvard as undergraduates, I'm sure we could afford to go and stay in exile too. I'm not here to defend the fact of how much money I have and how much money I don't have. But if somebody's got a problem, please go to a court of law and prove it. I'd be happy to answer, given the due process of law. Incidentally, you talked about my assets as if you knew what my income was. I think I'm earning more from this lecture tour than all that you said I earned in the year. So you must put things together properly.
Thank you.
My name is Nasser, and I run a little biotechnology company in Cambridge. My question is that in New York Times, every other year there's a survey which puts Pakistan on the top 5 countries in the world which are the most corrupt country in the world. I wondered that while you were in Pakistan as a prime minister twice, what did you do about it? And as you know, to do any kind of business in any other country, all the Western countries first look how easy it is to do business with, and taking into account the corrupt officials of the government.
You know, there is corruption all over the third world, and I'm sure there's a bit of corruption in the West also. Um, for instance, it's a question of perceptions. I myself wanted to introduce consultants when I was Prime Minister of Pakistan, because I know that every company coming to Pakistan doesn't know which door to knock on, and they want to know which door to knock on. They want to hire a consultant who will fix them their appointments. But I was told that's legalized corruption. But in the United States, consultancy is part of the game. So it's very difficult to differentiate what is corruption and what is not corruption. However, I will say this, that in a country like Pakistan, we often do not know that businessmen come to make profits, and that it is not a sin for businessmen to make profits. In the time that I was Prime Minister, massive foreign investment came into Pakistan. The growth rate tripled from 2% to 6%, and people were going on about corruption. Now the government is gone, foreign investment has dried up, 70,000 people have been sacked in 1 year alone because the government can't afford to pay salaries. And in one province, in 6 months alone, 86 people committed suicide because they couldn't find jobs and they couldn't support themselves. So what do we want? Do we want growth? Because if we want growth, it's not going to come with foreign aid. There is no foreign aid. It's going to come with foreign trade. And if foreign investment does come into Pakistan, the people who are going to come in are going to come in to make profits. And people are going to get rich in Pakistan and in the home country of those companies. So I think that we really need to find a balance of what we want. Do we want economic growth or not? If we want economic growth, there's going to be business and there's going to be charges of corruption. But that doesn't mean it's corruption. We, countries that had public sector domination, have to get used to market politics and deregulation and to private entrepreneurs who come in to make money. And we've got to appreciate that making money need not be sinful.
Up here on our balcony as well.
Yes, thank you very much for your stimulating talk. My name is Kath Furukawa. I'm a second-year student at Kennedy School. My question is, I have been curious to know, among the many leaders in the world, who has been your role model in your pursuit of political leadership as the first female prime minister in your country, and how would you evaluate yourself as compared to this your role model?
Well,
How
I
much
just
more-
loved, I don't think you're going to like my answer, but I just loved Margaret Thatcher. I knew you weren't going to like it. I was at Oxford when she was leader of the opposition, and my father was prime minister, and he invited her over, and I just looked at her, and I stared at her, and I said, just imagine being elected to run a country. And then later on, when I was in opposition, she actually became prime minister, and boy, was she rough and tough and mean, and I loved it.
Okay, one more question over here as well.
My name is Alexis Sinduhije. I'm from Burundi, Central Africa. Mrs. Bhutto, I have two small questions. First one, in so many underdeveloping countries, it's so difficult to know and to discover where is the power and who has the power. Can you explain us who and where is the power in Pakistan? This is the first question. The second one is, you said, and you are right, that the problem is ignorance in so many underdeveloping countries. And you know that so many political leaders exploit this ignorance of people to maintain their power. How could we educate these people with those powerful political leaders?
You know, it's a very good question about where power lies, because it lies in different places in different countries. For instance, in Pakistan, there was this great perception that power in America rested with the president. And, well, I mean, I'm sure it does to some extent, but as far as we're concerned, power rested in terms of Pakistan's issues of foreign and military assistance and aid that had been blocked or money that we'd paid, rested with the Congress. And it was only because I happened to have studied in America that I realized it was very important for Pakistan as a country not only to go to the presidency, but also to lobby in Congress, in the Senate, and in the Congress. And I think that's the reason why in my first term we got $4.6 billion of US military and economic assistance. And in my second term, we got the Brown Amendment, under which Pakistan received about $1 billion of military equipment and money. And of course, part of it was due to Mr. Mark Siegel, who's sitting in front of us and was Pakistan's chief lobbyist. He helped us really lobby. But you know, you need to know where power rests. In Pakistan, I thought power rested with the Prime Minister. But I found out that power rests with the Prime Minister in the economic sphere. Yes, power rests with the Prime Minister. In the social sphere, power rests with the Prime Minister. In the security sphere, 90% there would be a concurrence between the military and the security and the establishment and myself, but there'd be about a 10% difference. And I realized that power, even for a 10% difference, doesn't rest with the Prime Minister. So it differs. In some countries, power rests with the President, some countries with the Prime Minister, in some countries with the military, in some country with the Senate or with the Congress, and in some countries you find that different types of powers rest with different people. So if one is going in to give, to set up, say, an educational school, one will go and knock on one door. If one is going in with a proposal for security matters, one will go and knock on another door. And perhaps for me, that has become the essence of democracy, because I grew up in a dictatorship. So really, I thought, I mean, I grew up all my life as a struggle against General Zia. So it was really a question of one man having all power. And subconsciously, that affected me. And when I became Prime Minister, I realized that really, in a democracy, power is distributed in so many different places that one has to find the right door to knock for the right subject.
Yeah, Mrs. Bhutto. My name is Carl Miranda. I'm a Mason Fellow from the Philippines here at the Kennedy School. So many parallelisms have been drawn between you and our former President Corazon Aquino. You are both women leaders whose families were victims of injustice. You both came to power in 1986 after replacing what were ostensibly authoritarian regimes that perpetrated themselves in power. Cory Aquino, however, ushered the passing of a new constitution that limited the term of the chief executive to just 6 years, or just one term. This earned her the goodwill of the people and the moral authority over them. And she was seen as one who was trying to avoid the temptations of staying in power after the democratization process has already been achieved. Could you please tell us what your reasons were for running for re-election and why you apparently seek the prime ministership still today?
Well, I ran the first time round because I wanted to restore democracy. I ran the second time round because I wanted to vindicate my party's record in office. And I ran, I'm going to run the third time round because my party wants me to run. When the elections were over, I tendered my resignation as chairperson of the Pakistan People's Party, and I didn't want to take over as leader of opposition. But my party said that the people of this country look towards you and you can't let them down. So I'll run for my party, but whether I become prime minister third time or not, my party and I will decide when the elections are over.
Wouldn't you be falling into the trap of going into the evil that you, in the first place, replaced, like perpetrating yourself in power?
I don't want to perpetuate myself in power. I'd like nothing more than the time and the luxury to come to Harvard. I was just mentioning here to my hosts how wonderful I find it. I find the atmosphere stimulating. But you know, I always had a sense of duty. And I couldn't let people down. And I've paid a heavy price for that sense of duty in terms of my own personal peace and mental happiness. And after the last elections, I really wanted time out. But when I saw how disturbed and distressed people in my party were, when I saw how distressed people in the public were, I mean, people actually sobbed, and embraced me and said, you can't let us down, because if you're not there, who do we turn to? That I felt that we ought to defer this question for another time, and therefore I decided that I would continue to lead the Pakistan People's Party until the next election.
Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we are running out of time, but we have time for one last question.
Thank you, Ms. Bhutto, for your speech. My name is Karthik. I'm a senior at the college. I'm from India. I'm not going to ask you about Kashmir. I found it very interesting to hear you talk about Pakistan as a role model for the Muslim world. And I think that's an interesting concept because I'm also going to talk in terms of what you said of the so-called emancipation of the Afghans from communism. And how do you reconcile Pakistan's open support for the Taliban in Afghanistan, who are among the most extremist of Islamic political groups today? I mean, they don't want women educated. They don't want them out of parda. And they're acknowledged to be basically extremely, extremely conservative and orthodox. And the Afghanistans did not want the Soviets, but they want the Taliban even less. So I'm sorry, but far from leading the Muslims, Pakistan is allowing tyranny for strategic interests.
You know that, when there was a story my father used to tell us when we were growing up. He used to say the British had a forward policy and a buffer policy for Afghanistan. So sometimes the British would take over Kabul, and sometimes the British would retreat from Kabul and allow the tribesmen to take over. One day somebody asked the British Viceroy that, well, who are your friends? I mean, are the Afghans your friends, or the Afghans are not your friends? And he said, my dear boy, in politics, you don't have any permanent friends or any permanent enemies. In politics, you only have permanent interests. Now, that might be a terrible answer to give, but I give it because Pakistan has as its neighbors, you don't choose your neighbors, right? You're born with them. Pakistan has for its neighbors India, Iran, and Afghanistan. And we've got a dispute with India over Kashmir, and we are constantly concerned whether there will be a conflict or what will happen. So Pakistan naturally becomes very concerned about its relations with its other two neighbors, Iran and Afghanistan, that it should not deteriorate. Pakistan did not have any favorites in Afghanistan, but I think probably some members of the ruling classes were pleased that the pro-Indian forces had been routed from Kabul and replaced by pro-Pakistan forces. This does not mean to say that we endorse the policies or the politics of any of our neighbors. If I had something to do about choosing the new government in Afghanistan, well, that would be then my responsibility. But I can't even make myself Prime Minister of Pakistan, so I can hardly go around choosing the government in Afghanistan. I would like to say that I, as a woman and a Pakistani and a Muslim, am deeply concerned about the Taliban's practices relating to women, relating to education, and I have publicly denounced their discrimination against women.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry that we have run out of time. As you can see from the lines on all sides, we could continue this for many an hour, but unfortunately we've finished. And really, I would like to take up a couple of things. One thing is that you mentioned you'd like to come back to Harvard sometime. If ever you want a fellowship, if ever you'd like to be with us, we'd love to have you, and at any time. And I wonder if I could just end on this question, basically. You've painted a picture of politics where we lack civility. The politics of scandal, the machinery of scandal you talked about, and how difficult it is to be a politician nowadays. What's your advice to the young people here if they were interested in a political career? Would you say, really, nowadays, under these conditions, it's just not worth it? Or what's your best advice, given your experience in life in politics?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I'm tempted to say to the young people that it's not worth it. But when I look back and see how much we actually accomplished, I mean, for me, for instance, bringing the population growth rate down was very big, and we brought it down from 3.1% to 2.9%, and next it's targeted to go down to 2.6%. So that's a real change in people's lives. Building 30,000 primary schools was a real change in people's lives. increasing health expenditure by 60%, and getting a gold medal from the World Health Organization for that was a real sense of satisfaction. So what I'd like to say to the young people is that you can change things if you're in government. And if you've got the courage, go for it. But don't expect to be acknowledged in your lifetime, maybe later.